Still missing a couple of folks.
It looks easy.
Yeah.
Most of them are because I get mine with white. People making deposits.
Yeah, it was exciting.
Except for the last
All right, we ready?
Yes, sir.
Let's get ready to rock. All right, so today we've got a couple different things. One, taking a look at sort of portfolios and specifically talking a little bit about kind of some of the, I guess, risk return characteristics of those. But what we're going to sort of start with is to go through and calculate a before-tax internal rate of return using a couple of different assumptions. And so I've given you a couple of different handouts. So just so that, to eliminate confusion, one of the handouts is simply back in front of the same exact thing. It's the blank one, okay? The other handout that's stapled has a blank one on the front and then three that are sort of filled out that are slightly different from each other, okay? So we're gonna sort of start with basically those that are sort of filled out and go from there.
So really quickly, I know we're going to do internal rate of, I'll ask you once we do.
Okay, so what we're going to start with is, in this particular case, we're dealing with portfolio properties, okay? And one of the things that the text, kind of talks a little bit about are some of the different types of funds that you might invest in, whether it's a real estate investment trust, whether it's kind of a value add fund, whether it's core property, core plus, these terms that are typically used, and we're going to kind of get into some of that a little bit later in terms of the types of funds that are available to invest in to keep you from necessarily having to invest directly into real estate, but being able to invest through some sort of ownership vehicle that you can get in and out of a lot quicker than if you own the property outright. Does that make sense? Okay, like I said, we'll kind of get into that a little bit later. But what I want to start with, a couple of little calculations, and these are not too onerous given kind of some of the stuff that we've done previously, but I want to kind of walk you through some different assumptions and kind of get you to sort of think about a few things. So this first one, and we'll start with this first little example that I worked out for you. So you kind of turn the page over, and we've got the information here, and you're obviously going to have to calculate one of these on your own, but we'll work through this first one kind of together. All right, so in this particular case, we've got this portfolio of $250 million, I'm sorry, yeah, $250 million. Oops, put the numbers right. 250, 1, 2, 3. Okay. and a 75% loan to value ratio. So in this particular instance, we're going to be borrowing 75%. Obviously, equity would be 25% that we'll be putting in, but the whole purchase price, $250 million. So that means our loan amount, and what I've done for the purposes of your calculation to kind of help you, over here on the far left are kind of the operators that you need to employ to be able to do the calculations, okay? In terms of kind of plus, minus, add, divide, that sort of thing. So in this case, you're simply going to take the 250 million and you're going to multiply it by the 75%. So it should give you the 187,500, all right? And you can kind of go ahead and work down the page there a little bit. All right, in this case, we're going to make the assumption that the interest rate is an interest-only mortgage, okay? And we're doing that for the sake of simplicity, because if we start doing the amortization on this, it's going to get really messy really quick, so we're just going to stick with an interest-only mortgage. And in this case, the interest rate on the mortgage is going to be 6%, all right? So to get the annual debt service, all we're going to be doing is simply taking the loan amount, multiplying that by the interest rate, so you should end up with the $11,250,000, okay? Nothing surprising yet. All right. Now also, just to point out, like I've done in previous examples, all of the cells that are in yellow are the input cells. Everything else is a calculation, okay? So that kind of helps to give you perspective of what you're going to be given whenever you sort of start the process. So in this particular case, we're saying that the annual net operating income on the property is going to be 20 million, all right? And the growth rate associated with that income in this particular example is going to be 0, okay? Now, in another example, we will have a growth rate, but for this example, it's just going to be a 0% growth rate, all right? So what that means is whenever we come down here to our net operating income, we're going to start out, and well, actually, this is, I'm just going to go ahead and cell reference this, just so we won't have to, I don't have to retype it. Okay, so we start out with the $20 million in year 1 as our NOI. All right, and then once we've got that, then we're going to subtract out our annual debt service. So in this case, we're simply going to go back up here, capture the annual debt service number, and that number is going to stay constant all the way down, okay, because it's not going to change in the sense that it's going to be the same payment each year. And we're making the assumption, once again, kind of for simplicity, that it's interest only, but it's also going to be payments once a year, okay? So that kind of settles things. We don't have to worry about monthly payments, all right? So in this particular case, just from the standpoint of setting this up on Excel, what I'm going to do is pretty much just copy straight down. All right. Now then, for our before tax cash flow is simply going to be our net operating income, subtract out our annual debt service, so that we should end up with that. Okay? Pretty straightforward so far. All right. Now, and I'll go ahead and sort of copy that all the way down as well. Obviously, it won't be right until we fill in the others. Okay. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is set this up for making the assumption that it does have a growth rate. And so what I'm going to do is simply take the net operating income, and then I am going to multiply it by 1 plus whatever the growth rate is here. All right. In this case, it's not going to show anything, but let's just say I put in a growth rate of like 3%, then it should automatically take care of that and populate it. Does that make sense? Okay. And then I obviously want to be able to increase that every year thereafter, but in order to do that, what I'm going to have to do is make that a static cell reference real quick. And then just copy straight down. Oops, not that cell. Back up for a second. Okay, good. All right, and we'll get rid of that. Okay. All right, then, once we've got our net operating income, one of the questions that you're going to be asking is why are we calculating year 6 NOI? Okay, does anybody remember? Whenever we start applying a cap rate? For reversion purposes. Why do we use the 6th year?
You're selling
Okay, you're selling it when?
at the end of the
At the end of
year 5.
year 5. So what we have to do is we have to look forward to what is the expected income for year 6 in order to apply the cap rate. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's why we go ahead and go forward and calculate whatever the income is going to be in year 6. We don't need the before tax cash flow for year 6, all we need is the NOI because that's what we're going to be using with the cap rate. All right, so in this case, we've got a cap rate of 7.5%. All right, and so to apply that, all we're going to be doing is taking whatever that year 6 cash flow or net operating income is, excuse me, dividing it by the cap rate, and we should end up with then the resale price at the end of year 5 of the $266 million. Okay, everybody good with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the loan payoff, okay, obviously it's right there in front of you, but what are you really doing? You're just simply, you're basically paying off the amount that you originally borrowed because you haven't paid down any principal amount, so it's just the original amount that you borrowed, okay? Just the original debt. So in this case, we're simply going back up and we are getting the loan amount, popping that down there, and then we calculate what is the amount of equity that we're pulling out of the deal at the time of the sale. So we simply subtract one from the other, and so we end up with a $79 million total equity. Like we talked about last week, part of that is capital gain and part of it is equity reversion, okay? Make sense? All right. Then we move on and do another quick little subroutine. Here we've got the resale price at end of year 5 that we've simply pulled down from above. All right, and then we subtract out the purchase price so we can get a capital gain. So we go back up. All right, then to calculate the capital gain, subtract one from the other. And we end up with a $16 million capital gain. All right, and then here, for the moment, we're not going to talk too much about this. We're going to put in a 0% developer promote, but in order to calculate the dollar promote, we're simply going to take the capital gain times that percentage. So right now it's going to be a 0. Okay. Okay. And then finally, we're simply going to put in what are the actual cash flows that we're going to be using for the calculation of the before tax internal rate of return. So here, what we're going to start with is the initial equity that we put into this deal. Okay, so nowhere in essence on the sheet do we actually have that number written, but what is it? It is simply 25% of
the
original purchase price. So what we're going to do, go up.
Wouldn't it be 25, no?
Okay, we take the original purchase price, and then we are going to basically, whoops, hello. Jump around here. So we take that. And then we're going to multiply it by, in this case, 1 minus the loan to value ratio. Okay, so $62,500,000. But since this is a cash outflow to us, what we're going to need to do is turn that into a negative number. Okay, so we'll go ahead and at the beginning of the formula for this, we'll just make that a negative. All right, so now that will be our cash outflow at time period 0, the equity related to the project. Now, in terms of the actual cash flows, what we're going to be using is simply the before tax cash flow for each of the years. So we just kind of can go up, capture those, bring those down. All right, just kind of copy down. All right, now for the final year cash flow, what's happening? Okay, for the final year's cash flow, we have the before tax cash flow, the 87,500, or I'm sorry, 8,750,000, but we also are going to have the reversion of the equity we need to basically add to that as part of that cash flow. All right, so we can go ahead and take that and add, let's see, in this case, yep, reversion of the equity. Okay, and then we're also going to be then subtracting out the developer promote. We'll get to that here in a second. Okay. Equals to the minus. Okay, good. No. Try that one more time. Plus capital gain. Minus.
Yeah.
Yep, okay, there we go. Okay, so that would, once again, that's going to be the year 5 before tax cash flow, the equity reversion, and then also whatever we're getting on the developer promotes, which in this particular example we're not. And then we're going to be solving for the internal rate of return. So there, just simply internal rate of return, capture basically those cells, and we should end up with, yeah, 17.75%. Okay, now, just for this example, let me also change the view on this to where it's a little bit easier to see, or at least for me. Okay, so does all of that make sense, what we did from beginning to end? And we're going to talk about the developer promote, we'll talk about the growth rate, that sort of thing. Yep.
Just a quick question. So for this, just conceptually, why are we using just the reversion of the equity rather than just like the overall sales price?
Because we're wanting to just capture what is our return on equity.
Okay, and then the second question is conceptually for IRR as well. Like, I understand IRR and how to calculate it and everything like that, but still, like, really, like, why is IRR so important all the time? You know, like, really conceptually, why an investor would like look at IRR, like,
Because it's their return on whatever money they have put into the deal.
okay,
So it's just simply saying that if you've, made an investment of $100 and at the end of the year you have $110, your rate of return is going to be basically 10%.
so would that 17.75% be on an annual basis then?
And it is annualized, yes.
Okay.
So it's 17% basically per year for the 5-year overall.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But it may be slanted toward basically the value of the reversion or potentially the cash flows, which we're going to be working a problem. We'll kind of go through that as well.
That makes sense.
So, but once again, for this one, all we're simply saying is, yeah, the 62,500,000 is our cash money equity into the deal. The 8,750,000 is our before tax cash flow to the investors. And then at the end, we're going to have whatever that before tax cash flow is, plus whatever the reversion of the equity was. And then we're going to talk about the developer promote here in a second.
So if you weren't calculating just to figure out what your percentage return on your exact dollar amount as far as equity, then you would just look at the cap then, right?
Well, you could, I mean, once again, you could just look at it as cash in, cash out, but then that doesn't inherently take into account the time value of money. I mean, it's a question of, if you've got a really short holding period, like, 6 months or a year, it may make much more sense to just simply look at cash in, cash out. But when you've got a holding period that's 5 years, you need to have some way of being able to kind of say a 5-year hold and making that equivalent to a 1-year hold or a 10-year hold or whatever. An internal rate of return allows you to do that because it annualizes the return.
And it accounts for debt.
Or whatever, yeah.
And cap rate doesn't have debt.
No, cap rate doesn't have debt.
Yeah, so like that would skew your.
Right. The cap rate is just simply using your net operating income. It doesn't take into account any sort of leverage or any sort of debt involved in the deal. Okay? All right?
So if you were to, I got it.
Okay. So that is the first scenario. So that is basically page 1. Okay? Or, well, page 2 in one sense, the handout. Okay. So flip over to the next one.
Before you move on, can you show us again how to do this on the calculator?
Yep, we're going to do it on the calculator as well.
Okay.
But I just want to work through the worksheets first, and then we'll go back to the calculator. It's just going to be easier that way to kind of explain it. Okay, so the next one is going to be assuming a growth rate for, in this case, the net operating income. Well, obviously in Excel, pretty darn easy. Once you've kind of built the formula in there, you're able just to kind of go in this particular case, it's a 2% growth rate. And so what you're going to see change is the net operating income for each year, okay? And, yeah. So for each year of the net operating income, that is going to increase by 2% each year. Your debt service is going to stay constant, but your before tax cash flow is obviously going to change. We're going to keep your cap rate the same, but what you're going to see is because of that income growth rate, what impact that has on the bottom line with respect to our internal rate of return. So we go from having basically in the previous example a 17.75% internal rate of return to a 23.88% internal rate of return. So all of that change or all that difference is due to that 2% growth rate in the rents, okay, or in the net operating income. All right, does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no?
That's
Okay.
not inflation, isn't it?
Yeah, basically it's inflation, or you're just simply saying that for, whatever the tenants are in these properties, that you're just sort of saying, on average, they're going to be increasing their payments to you, in one sense, 2% a year. Okay? All right. So that makes that one pretty simple. And then the third one, on the back page, this is where we get into the developer promote. Okay? So I'm just going to go ahead and type it in, and I'm going to explain it. So in this case, what we're saying is that the developer is going to receive 40% of the capital gain off of the sale of the property at the end of 5 years. So whatever fees the developer may be getting, for that first 5 years, we're not really considering that. All we're sort of considering is at the back end of this deal, the developer is not going to be inherently a partner in the deal. In other words, they could basically have no cash investment whatsoever, but yet they're being paid this promote to, in essence, ensure the property, is fully leased, that it is operating well, and ultimately, is in great shape for the investors. And so the only really charge is going to be at the end of this deal, and you're simply going to say, all right, whatever capital gain, either in the sale price of the property or in the value of the property. If you have it independently valued, you're going to pay 40% of that capital gain to the developer. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay, so in this particular case, for this property, the resale price at the end of year 5 was this $294 million, which is based on the cap rate and the income the property was generating. The original purchase price was $250 million, meaning the capital gain was $44 million. And so if you're paying the developer 40% of that capital gain, then you're paying them $17 million basically for all of their troubles associated with this particular property. Does that make sense? Yes or no?
When you say that the developer is taking care of all the charges, he's taking care of it out of his own money because he didn't invest in the equity.
He didn't invest in the equity, but he may be getting paid a developer fee, you know, while the project is being undertaken, or he's foregoing maybe even all fees until the very end. Okay?
Even management fees as well too?
Potentially.
Okay.
Okay? But we're making the assumption that the developer is not putting any equity in the deal. All they're simply doing is maybe just think of it like this. I'm the developer, you come to me as an investor and say, I need to have a building built, all right, and I'm gonna, you're gonna pay me a fee potentially to get through the development process, but at the end, my real bonus, if you will, my promote, is gonna be a significant percentage of whatever the value that I've managed to create in that property. Does that make sense? And so in this case, it's just simply going to be 40% of whatever the capital gain is.
Is it always based on capital gain, not?
It doesn't have to be. Okay? In this particular case, that's what I just, termed it to be. But it could be based on
Cash flow?
cash flows. It could be based on, the long-term leases and what maybe value has been created there. It could, there's a whole wide assortment of things that can be based on.
There's no standard?
There's nothing that's absolutely standard. I mean, that's, I think, one of the biggest things to sort of get out of your head is there's almost nothing standard because everybody has a different way of sort of viewing it and what they're trying to accomplish. And so for this particular example, we're just making the assumption, all right, they're going to get 40% of the capital gain. Okay? All right, so if that's the case, what happens is that 17 million gets removed from basically this total reversion amount here at the end, okay? So if we just kind of walk back up here just for a second, kind of keep your eye on the year 5 cash flow. So without the promote being taken out, the investor would have gotten 117 million. With the promote,
Yes,
with the promote, here we go. Is it the one, let's say 30 or 40, I'm sorry.
That's fine.
40, yeah, okay. All right, so with the promote being taken out, then it drops down to basically 99 million, so obviously drops down about $17 million, okay? So any questions on that? Okay, so now what we're gonna do is basically take all of that and work through on the calculator, okay? All right, so any questions about process or just kind of anything you don't quite understand, why we did what we did, and okay, all right.
Are you normally looking at it before tax?
I did on this example just because I wanted to keep it relatively straightforward, but the other thing to keep in perspective, that most of the time, the entities that we're looking at may be pass-through entities of ownership. Therefore, from the owner of this entity may not actually have to pay tax on it. It's whoever they distribute basically dividends to that may end up having to pay tax on it. And so for each of those individuals, it may be a different tax rate. Therefore, That's why in many cases you do it on a before tax basis, because you may have one tax rate, you're gonna have a different tax rate, you're gonna have a different tax rate depending on what other income sources you have. Okay? All right. So let's just sort of start off and make sure that you are, so I suppose probably the first place that we really need, or if only, that I'm assuming you can do all of the calculations basically down to the actual cash flow piece. Is that correct? There's nothing, in other words, none of the other pieces that you really should have to have problems with at all. That's just pretty much adding and subtracting. Yes? Okay. So on the cash flow, and potentially you should be able to do this as well, but let's just go ahead and kind of work through it. So in this particular case, we will just go ahead and use the first example. All right. So using your financial calculator, the first thing, we're going to make the assumption this is one payment per year. And we're going to use the cash flow function. We don't have to use the cash flow function since the dollar amount is the same each year, but for consistency for this problem, we'll go ahead and use the cash flow function. Because we could just use present value, future value payment and calculate and solve for the interest rate. We'll actually do it both. What the heck? All right. So let's look at the cash flow function. So 62,500,000. That's going to be your initial cash outflow, followed by the 8,750,000 as a cash flow. Now, to shortcut this process a little bit, if you're using the cash flow function, how many times does that specific dollar amount happen?
4.
4. So you can simply take and put in 4 shift in sub j, okay, which is obviously right below the cash flow key. That just tells it that's happening 4 times, okay? And then your final cash flow will be the reversion, everything added in together. So that would be the 87,916,666.67 as your final cash flow. And then you should just be able to solve for internal rate of return and get the 17.75%. Okay, let me just double check it myself. Yep, 17.746, okay? All right, everybody good with that? Yes? Okay. Now, as I said, you could also just done it as a present value, future value. Relatively the same setup in this particular case. You're still going to have 62,500,000. But now, instead of it being a cash flow, it would simply be what?
Present value.
Present value. Okay. The 8,750,000
Would be payments.
would be a payment. It would occur for 5 years. But this is where it gets a tiny bit tricky, and that is for your future value, it is only going to be what?
The minus, that minus 87.5.
In other words, it's going to be this minus the 8750.
So the 79.
Okay?
79,
Because, once again, the way the calculator does the present value, future value function is it's saying this 8750 is occurring 5 times, but also simultaneous with that 5th one, we're just going to go ahead and then add in whatever the future value is. So in this case, that amount would be what?
The
79 million, right? 79,166,000. Everybody see that?
The reverse.
As I said, the reason for the difference between those two is simply the way the calculator sort of organizes things. We'll draw a quick little timeline just to make sure that everybody's on the same page.
You can use either or of these, right?
For this one, yes. I would advocate for consistency's sake and the fact that the others are going to, you're going to have to use the cash flow function to probably stick with using this. But I just want to show you that yes, it can be done this way if the payment is constant. Okay? So let's just go ahead and do this one real quick just to make sure it does match.
Yeah.
Yep, it does. Okay. Now, just to kind of make sure, for those of you that are still maybe struggling just a little bit with this, so sort of take a look at what's happening.
Why would you do it? Like, I know you wanted to show us both, that you do it both ways, but is one advantageous to the other? Or like conceptually, like why? You know?
Well, okay. It's really, both are still cash flows. It's just that you can do it this way if the payments are fixed. If the payments are not fixed, you can't use this approach. You have to use the cash flow function.
But you could do multiple payments, no?
No.
Huh.
No, with this approach, you are stuck with one singular payment for the duration. Whereas with the cash flow function, you can change it from 1 year to the next, which we will do obviously for kind of the next example, okay? But just to sort of show you,
But realistically, the payment could never really be the same. I mean, the same exact number.
well, well, a mortgage payment's the same every single month or every single year.
No, but that particular number.
No, well, in this particular problem, it is the same because it is simply the 8750 each year because there's no growth rate attached to it. Okay, now in the next one, which we will do, you have a growth rate, you are forced to use the cash flow function. Okay, that's part of what I want to make sure that we are clear about. Okay, but in terms of kind of a timeline looking at this, you know, sort of what's happening is you've got the 62.5 million down here that is sort of a cash outflow, and then you've got a cash inflow of 8.75 million. Each year, and then in the fifth year, you also then have this 79 point, let's just call it 2 million. And so the difference is, using the cash flow function, it simply adds those two together, or you have to add those two together for the final cash flow, whereas with the present value and future value function, it allows you to keep them separate. Okay, does that make sense? All right, any questions on that? All right, moving forward. Okay. So just so that we are clear, so let's take a look at the second example. And once again, just the cash flow piece. Just to work out another example of it. So one payment per year. And in this case, once again, 62,500,000 as our first cash flow, time period 0. Then the 8,750,000 as a cash flow. And then this is where, once again, now we have to use the cash flow function because the next cash flow is going to be 9,150,000 as a cash flow. Then 9,558 as a cash flow. And then 9974. Feel my eyes. Yeah, 160. Cash flow. And then for the final year, basically simply adding in the reversion. So 117, 320, 190, 72. That's that final year's cash flow. And then once again, solving for internal rate of return. And so you should end up with 23.88%. Okay, just double check yourself. I'll do it as well. Yep. Okay. All right. Anything else we need to demonstrate with respect to calculations on this? Yep.
How do you, the loan pay off at the end of year 5?
Mm-hmm.
How do you calculate that?
That's just simply the amount you borrowed.
Oh.
So if you go back up to the very top, the loan amount.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Because since it's an interest-only mortgage, no principal's been paid off, so you still have whatever you originally borrowed that you owe. Okay? All right, any questions?
What kind of deal is this?
What do you mean?
Like such big numbers.
What is, it basically is a big portfolio. Okay? So you may have, you know, obviously multiple large properties that are just sort of into this, you know, sort of package. All right? Okay, so let's do this. Let's make sure that you can kind of do one of these from scratch. All right? So you give me the numbers that you want to use. Okay, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 inputs. All right. So we're going to write them down up here in terms of the assumptions. So this will be the thing to fill in on the first sheet of the stapled things. We've got LTV, we've got the interest rate, we've got annual net operating income, annual NOI growth rate, and we've got residual cap rate, and then finally the developer promote percentage. Okay, so give me a dollar amount for the purchase price for the portfolio.
10 million.
How much?
10 million.
It's a small one, but okay.
250 million to 10 million.
Okay, 100 million.
No discount.
That's everything's fine. Okay, loan to value. 60%? Okay. Interest rate?
5.5.
5.5. Okay, annual NOI? It's gonna probably be $1 million or less.
2 million.
Okay. All right. And the growth rate for the NOI?
2%.
How much?
2.
Okay. The cap rate on sale?
6.5.
Okay. And the developer promote percent?
1%.
Maybe the developer's something to work with.
20%.
20%, what the heck? Okay, all right, there are your assumptions. Get busy. Ready to see how quickly you can do it.
We're gonna use the sheet.
Just use the front sheet. First person to finish with pure accuracy gets an extra 10 points on their quiz today. So there's an incentive.
It's not fair, Judson's gonna win.
If you get stuck somewhere, I will answer a question. Okay, so you can start checking yourself. Here is the before tax cash flow piece. I'm not going to go all the way down the page until a little bit later, but if you want to check yourself to see if you're right up to that point.
Is there a developer promote? Where does that go in? Like once we
That's later in the spreadsheet.
Yeah, but at the very end of the cash
Yep.
flows, do
You
we
subtract it out.
at the
Yep.
at the end?
Yep. Just as written there. What? You're done? Okay, what did you get as your answer?
32.28 for the IR.
Yep. There you go. Okay, congratulations. Okay, so let's go ahead and put the whole thing up here so you can kind of see. All right, so you can kind of check yourself. Okay, first, let's just sort of start at the very kind of top. Okay, everybody at least get down to this point.
Yeah.
No issues there? Everybody good?
I wouldn't call it that.
Huh?
Okay. And then about the resale price, just out of curiosity, so how many of you at least got to like right here to got the resale price at end of year 5, you got that number right?
Yeah.
Most everybody? Okay. If you didn't, what, you just didn't get there or you didn't get it right?
I just didn't put the growth rate like an idea.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. Rookie mistake there.
Okay. So there's everything else. If you want to kind of write those down so you've got them.
It's just the equity you put in. This here is not that.
Yeah, because we put 60, so we need to put 40%.
Oh, it's a delta. Yeah, that's right. It's a delta. This is 40%.
Okay. Any questions? All right, so that'll get you through the first 3 questions of the quiz. All right. Feel comfortable? Yes? No? Possibly could be? Okay, let's do this. It's almost 9 o'clock. I know that there's a lot of calculations. So take a quick 5-minute break. Once again, there's still food upstairs, so you might want to, if you want to grab some food, do that real quick, and then come back and we'll get started with the remainder of the stuff. The remainder of the stuff should go pretty quick by comparison.
It's minus the development promote, right?
Because the investor is not receiving that promote because they're paying it to the developer.
Oh.
Oh, no, shit, I'm wrong. Yeah, yeah, it's working.
Close on that.
You all just want to sit there for the whole 5 minutes and then you got a chance to get up, move around, do something?
Oh, like you said, it's been less than an hour.
I know. I figured some people were hungry. Nice quick break between the remainder of the stuff. Yep.
Yeah.
Scroll like that or other way?
Yeah, I'm gone.
This might get back 28%.
That's a very good
I have no clue.
That's more important.
Mine is this.
That doesn't mean anything, it's like, never heard of it.
Yeah, close enough. You're throwing darts.
Sure.
I made these.
How? Are they fake? How are they real?
What are you? Oh, I don't know. Whoever sells them is up in my car.
How?
I have no idea. I think you like to sit this one. Die. I don't know.
$7?
I
You deliver them?
if they want me to. I don't care.
It's a gesture. A gesture of love.
Yeah. Just gives me a honey scent. I didn't finish the last. I did. Not really good. That stuff.
You wanted everyone else to feel good. I don't remember last week because what did you get wrong?
Got the first one wrong. Then the third one.
I don't remember what they were.
I didn't know that. He wasn't here. He was like, yeah. Maybe you like it all this time. Something?
105. I don't know how.
Must have hurt.
Yeah, the curve is definitely brutal.
Good.
What'd you get? I got like 102, 104.
So that's the next that will happen.
What's going on? You got classes?
I need to get hundreds in here. The rest of it is.
Why? It's 23rd. Good to see you here getting that.
Okay, has everybody got everything written down they need to have written down off of this one? Yes? Okay, good.
Maybe get in August.
What was the IRR
For
for
real?
Yeah, 78. How?
Why?
I don't know. What'd you get?
32.1 years.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, 29.
How?
Sorry.
He said, did you look at your comment?
I can't read them.
Oh. On my comments, he was like, why did you talk to the retail? What? What do you mean? I just put number 10.
That's that kind of took an L on this one paragraph. I'm not doing.
Didn't you shake his hand?
Yeah, I was like, I'm not doing it.
Seven's due on Monday.
Okay. Missing there one or two. All right, so what I've done, I'll go ahead and get started. We're still missing a couple of people, but so I'm kind of going back to our previous scenario, the sort of the third scenario we worked out with the developer promote, the handout. And what I'm going to do is just kind of walk through a couple of different things to sort of highlight impacts that certain key variables sort of have on the outcome. So this is just to kind of get a sense for whether or not you're really thinking about this the way that you should. So all other things left constant, what would happen to our before tax internal rate of return if we were to have a higher loan to value ratio?
Go up,
It would go up. Why would it go up?
less money.
You have less money invested, more leverage, so let's just see if that's true, all right? So let's say that we go from 75% loan to value, and that, once again, it's a 20.71 before tax internal rate of return. So we borrow more, let's say 80%. So that extra 5% of borrowing translates into a 23% return. So almost a 4% increase in the overall return to the investor by virtue of borrowing more. Okay, does that make sense? Yes? Okay. Now with the promote, we obviously understand the more we pay out in a promote, the less return that we get as the investor. All right? So if we were to raise the promote to 50%, that's going to lower our return by about 1%. All right? So what is, try to explain this, but I want you to put it in your own words. What is the real benefit of paying a developer a promote fee?
So they want to turn it over quicker?
Okay, that'd be one motivation, yeah.
Incentives for it to go well.
Yeah, incentives for it to go well. Anything else?
The more they sell it, they get a percentage of it?
Yeah, so there's an incentive to maximize the value of the property. Okay, so all of those are excellent reasons for obviously paying a promote to the developer. Now, obviously, some investors maybe a little bit stingy as it relates to that, but to a certain extent, you do get what you pay for. I mean, if you really are wanting to ensure you maximize the value, that's one way to potentially ensure it is to, especially if you have a developer that obviously you can trust to do the right thing. Okay, let's just see, anything else we might want to modify? Okay, so the cap rate, the residual cap rate, what impact would that have on our internal rate of return if we were to, let's say, lower the residual cap rate? Now, keep in mind, what does it mean if we lower the residual cap rate in terms of the market? How do they view that?
Smaller return?
Okay, it's smaller return, but inherently they're sort of saying that we value the property that much more. We're sort of saying you're minimizing the risk, therefore we're willing to accept less in income off the property and pay more for the property. Okay, so if we were, in this case, under this scenario that we currently have, 22.9 is the before tax internal rate of return with those other assumption changes we made. So let's say we can lower the cap rate to 6%. That raises us to a 30% overall return. Okay, so pretty significant jump there. And all that's really impacting is the reversion. Okay, the resale price. I'm just simply saying that investors ultimately are going to be willing to pay you more money for the property for the same amount of income because they view that income to be more stable, more secure, and so that's going to have obviously a translation into inflating your overall income rate return. So think about this just from a standpoint, from a strategy perspective, kind of from ownership. Because one of the examples we're going to kind of talk about here in a few minutes is, you know, to what level do you have control over your operating income, and then ultimately how that may translate into an increase or a decrease in the overall valuation of the property. What could you do operationally while you own this property for 5 years to potentially manipulate the reversion? To make it go up, or to make it go down, or make me stay the same?
Increase rents.
What was the question?
I'm sorry?
Increase rents.
Okay, increasing rents, if, assuming the market would bear it, then that would have a flow-through effect on potentially increasing the reversion. If you kept the cap rate constant, yes?
Yes.
Okay, what else?
Lower expenses?
Okay, if you lowered operating expenses, you hope that that would have, definitely have a flow-through effect in the sense of more operating income, but what might be the case if you're lowering operating expenses? What is a side effect potentially of that? Potentially. I'm sorry?
You deteriorate the quality.
Yeah, the property, you're not doing maybe certain repairs and maintenance that may need to be done to maintain it to a, you know, livable, acceptable sort of level, and you might end up longer term losing tenants in the property, okay? What else might you be able to do to manipulate it?
You can also lower the, increase the vacancy, so you can lower the price.
Okay, you can
Increase the vacancy.
increase the vacancy or increase the occupancy?
Well, either or.
No, it's not the same. One is the opposite of the other.
Well, of course, but
Okay, you want to make the property more full or less full?
less full.
Okay, if you want to make the property less full, why?
Lower the value. I mean, the value.
But why would you want to do that? Okay, you're saying, okay, you could do that, but why would you want to do that? Is there a reason?
Depends on, well,
To get a lower value.
yeah, to get a lower, well, to get a lower loan to value, or just,
But why would you want to do that?
He wants to increase the reversion.
well, normally you would want to increase it, I understand that.
Okay, all right.
You just want to, just.
You just want to
get
be
it out.
contrary
Right,
and do
yeah,
something
well,
different.
absolutely.
Okay, fair enough.
I was
All right.
building something in my head.
All right.
Add
Cool.
value.
I'm sorry?
Just add value to the property.
Okay, but in what way?
TI?
Okay, in terms of like tenant improvements, is that what you're saying?
Also,
I'm sorry, is that what you said, TI or?
yeah.
Okay, yeah, tenant improvements that maybe there are some tenant improvements that you make on the property that ultimately maybe would that maybe initially might lower your operating income, but long-term could possibly increase the value. But that's a tricky one because you're spending money, and sometimes it's difficult to get a new investor to fully appreciate value that you really have put into that property unless they can see that it has a direct connection to hopefully increased rents, you know, longer term. Now, if you did the TIs, you know, at the very beginning of the 5 years, then, you know, hopefully that would have a positive increase on the rents. But maybe, what if you wait until the end of 5 years, right before you sell it, to do those TIs?
Yeah, it wouldn't make sense.
It wouldn't really make sense because, you know, they're not really going to fully appreciate that. It's kind of like, the best analogy I can give on that is, you know, you get ready to sell a car, okay? And you put new tires on it or you don't put new tires on it. Is that really going to have a noticeable, you know, difference in the amount that you're going to be able to sell it for? Well, it depends on the buyer. You know, in some cases, a buyer might say, oh, these are brand new tires. That cost you, you know, whatever, so therefore I'm willing to add that to whatever price that, you know, originally we negotiated. Other buyers will say, I don't really care whether you have new tires or not, you know. So I mean, the same sort of thing in terms of the real estate analogy is in many cases to really see the real flow-through effect of improvements that you make to it. In many cases, you know, you've got to have some years of operating history to really see that value. But excellent, okay.
CAM charges?
I'm sorry?
CAM charges?
Okay, in terms of common area maintenance charges that potentially would increase the revenue flow, is that what you're sort of saying? Yeah, okay.
Maybe the quality of the tenants, like getting in like
Sure.
high credit.
Yeah, maybe whenever you bought the property, you had a bunch of, you know, Class C sort of tenants, and by virtue of them in Class C, difficulty maybe in knowing whether or not you were going to collect the rent you should be collecting, and maybe even not just that, but also even the price point of the rent, you know, whether or not it was really the maximum rent you could be charging, whereas completely overhauling the tenant base, you know, being able to charge higher rents but also have higher quality tenants that are more apt to pay it? Sure. Okay? Excellent. All right. It's clear you guys are onto this. Okay. All right. Any other thoughts, questions, observations on this before we leave it? Okay. Good. Moving forward.
I do have a question in terms of adding value, which is, there was like a real estate investor that I would look up to as like one of like a mentor that I would aspire to be like, and his strategy in his head is he like loves office because he can buy a building that's like 30 or 40% vacant and fill it. And to him that's like obviously, you know, the various improvements, but in terms of like adding value as opposed to like buying a dilapidated house or dilapidated like multifamily or something like that. What are your thoughts?
No, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, okay, so the question is, in terms of adding value, and, you know, is it maybe easier to add value for an office building than it is maybe for a traditional like multifamily or you know, some other sort of project? And yeah, if you, I mean, okay, number one, if you know how to find the tenants, to source the tenants and get them into the property for the office, absolutely. Because there, you know, there is a very special skill set to be able to do that. More so than just simply renting out units in a multifamily project, which almost anybody can do. But, you know, sourcing those office tenants is a lot more challenging of, you know, finding people that, whether maybe they already exist somewhere else, their leases are about to expire, you're aware of that, you're able to kind of swoop in and maybe lure them into these, you know, long-term leases and you know, throw some tenant improvements, you know, their direction to make the space that much more attractive to them. So yeah, the value creation there may be a little bit easier, you know, than it might be for, not easier, it may, well, easier for a person with a skill set than it would be competing with all the other players out there in the market that are, you know, focusing on multifamily.
So what is the strategy to fill that? Like run Facebook ads or like what do you think?
That would be, I mean, my suspicion is whoever that person is, you know, probably has their own approach that they've been using that, you know, is maybe unique to them. That's why they're good at it. You know, whatever that is, you know, in terms of being able to source, as I said, lease expirations. And if they can do a good job of sourcing those and then go and have the conversations with those tenants, you know, 6 months to a year before their lease expires, wherever they are, and as I said, lure them into their space, you know, that's going to be probably the approach.
Do you think that it's risky to buy buildings that are like, let's say 20 or 30, 40% vacant, I mean filled, and then, you know, be losing money, but on, you know, once you fill it 3 years down the line, that it's worth like whatever, 10 million.
No, I get what you're saying, because whenever the property is being valued by a lender or by an appraiser, an empty property or virtually empty property, they have to take that into consideration because that's all part of the income approach of saying, you know, this property is vacant, but then they also should be assessing what is kind of a likelihood that we would be able to, you know, fill this property up. You know, is there a reason why it's not being, you know, currently filled? You know, is there market saturation of similar property types that preclude it from being filled? You know, are the rents, you know, going to be sufficient, you know, in order to fill it? I mean, and sometimes they do a good job with that, sometimes they don't. You know, in terms of the pricing of it or the valuing of it. Because probably what happened in a lot of those cases is you have someone that bought an office building. This is just a hypothetical scenario. They bought an office building, and maybe it was pretty much leased whenever they bought it. A couple of major tenants move out.
Exactly.
All of a sudden, that owner loses the property through foreclosure because they couldn't keep the property occupied because, you know, you're stuck with, you know, trying to find a fairly sizable tenant, and if you're not able to do so within a roughly short time horizon, you're going to be so upside down on the ability to pay the mortgage and pay the other operating expenses, you're going to go into foreclosure. The bank is going to take possession of it. They're going to mark it down in value to probably what they have in it, and in some cases even less, and take a loss on it just to get it, you know, off their books. And so whoever sort of swoops in is able to buy it. They're able to buy it at a depressed price, and if they, have a plan of being able to accurately identify prospective tenants that can take on, large chunks of space, maybe even at a bargain basement price in terms of the rent, get the property filled up again and make it work. Because what you're sort of describing.
So everything is based on income. So I guess the question stems is like, if the property is completely vacant, it's not worth zero.
No, it is and it's not.
Exactly. So it's like,
I mean, there is a base level bricks and sticks value, no question about it. But that's purely using the cost approach. Using the income approach, the building may be worth almost nothing. But here's what what you're describing is kind of like, let's just say that you've almost got two identical buildings, building A, building B. Let's say this one, $30 a square foot rent, and it's virtually 100% occupied. All right, this one over here maybe is $35 per square foot, and it's maybe 75% occupied. All right. Now, very simplistically, what you would ordinarily say is, well, this person should be doing what? Lowering their rent down to $30 a square foot or pretty close to it, in order to maybe steal some tenants from over there over to here. But let's say that for whatever reason they're not able to, okay? Because if they do that, there's a very good chance that maybe their lender won't allow it. That maybe the lender has lease approval that says, okay, you got to have a certain quality of tenant, or you got to have a certain price point, and maybe they won't allow it. So for whatever, or it also could be that these guys over here have an amazing property management team and leasing team, and that's how they're able to keep the building full. Over here, not so much. Okay? Well, think about what happens. All right? Over time, this property may lose that many more tenants out in the market. Well, all of a sudden, maybe they drop down to 60%. Well, once they drop down to, let's say, 60%, they're not able to function. It ends up basically end up in foreclosure, okay? And if that ends up in foreclosure, then what's going to happen is somebody else is going to be able to buy it. But this is the part that begins to get interesting, is they're able to buy it at a depressed price, and they're going to be able to reset for this property and this property only, the rent to $25 a square foot, because their cost basis is so much less than potentially what this property had. Okay, now all of a sudden, this person's able to charge $25 a square foot because their cost basis is so much less. They're able to do what? Steal a good portion of the tenants from over here to put them over here, potentially putting this one into bankruptcy. You follow me? Mm-hmm. There begins to be almost, and it's just a vicious, potentially market cycle if there's, an oversupply of space and not that many tenants to go around. I mean, it's not a super fast moving train, but yet, it can be definitely sort of a slow, wreck from the standpoint of there are only so many relatively large tenants that you can just kind of easily migrate from one property to another.
Yeah, because that's what you were saying. He's saying that there was a big CBD office, and then a major tenant moved out, and he lost 80% of his rent. And so he lost it, and he ended up getting a $30 million discount on the building.
Right.
Like the person paid 40 or whatever, and he picked it up for 13.
Right.
And there's other investors that are buying $50 million hotels that say I'm completely scared of office because I can't fill them. I don't know how to fill them. And then this guy over here is just, that's what he wants.
Right.
So it's just very interesting because
everybody has kind of a niche, what they're good at, and and some people that's what they're really good at is filling those properties that other people maybe for whatever reason can't seem to do.
Because what other value add is there to office? Clean it?
Well, I mean, other than the tenant improvements that may be present, that you have a law firm that maybe moved out that has really nice finish out that you're able to sort of take advantage of, but outside of that, probably not a whole lot.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Moving forward. Okay. So one of the things we're going to talk for a couple of minutes about, sensitivity analysis. So part of what I was trying to demonstrate a little bit earlier with the kind of the examples we worked through, today is, as you change one of the variables, what impact does that have kind of on the bottom line and so forth. And so fundamental within kind of real estate analysis is this whole idea of the sensitivity analysis of sort of saying, okay, you change one factor, what is the flow-through effect to other factors, okay? You change the rents, you change the occupancy level, you change the cap rate, you change, whatever. How does that then ultimately impact the viability of a project? Does that make sense to everybody? All right? So let's just sort of take a relatively simple sort of scenario and say that we've got a property that we purchased for, give me a dollar amount.
$5 million.
$5 million is our purchase price. Okay? And let's say we're going to hold it for 5 years. All right, and what sort of annual revenues on this property might we have?
$500,000.
Okay. So $500,000 of annual revenue. And here I'm not being overly specific as to whether it's before tax cash flow, NOI, whatever, just we're saying revenue, just generically, just to kind of illustrate the point. Okay. And the resale price at the end of that 5 years, we want to just keep it at $5 million?
$6 million.
Let's just go ahead and keep it at $5 million.
That's it.
All right, kind of a boring one, but on purpose, okay? All right, so in this case, calculate the rate of return. You should probably be able to do it in your head. What is it?
0?
No?
No, it's 10%. 10%.
10%?
10%.
Okay, but let's just go ahead and just approve. Okay, one payment per year.
You're just accounting for the cash flows. So.
You're putting in $5 million as your present value. You're putting in $500,000 as your payment. You're putting in $5 million as your future value. You're putting in your term as 5 years. And then you're solving for basically the rate of return, interest rate, whatever you want to call it. All right, so let's just double check.
Well, why did you do that? Like, shouldn't you do the 5 and before the future value?
You can do it either way. The order of these 4 variables doesn't matter. You can have any of them in any order. What matters is what are you solving for? It's going to be last. Just to prove the point. Okay, 5 million,
Yeah, because it's
500,000.
Last payment that you're getting extra.
5 million, 10%. Okay. Does everybody see that? Now, as I said, this is super simple because all you really have to do is to say, okay, we're buying the property and we're selling the property for the same amount, so there's no return there. So the only other than return of basically income, okay, or not return of income, but return of principal or return of capital, okay? So we're getting paid back exactly what we put in, assuming all cash sort of deal. So the only return that we're really getting is from the operating cash flow or operating revenue. And we're saying 500,000 basically divided by 5 million is simply 10%. Okay, so that is the calculation. Now, just to see if you potentially, well, what if rents or income were to go up by 5%, okay? If this number were to be increased by, don't do it on the calculator, if this number were to go up by 5%, what is going to be the flow-through effect? how sensitive is that really going to impact your rate of return here? Now be careful, this is not probably what you think it is. So if we increase this by 5%, what's going to be the flow-through effect? It's going to go up, yes, but by how much?
2.5%.
0.5.
Okay, so let's just see. So first of all, let's just see, well, what is that increase? So times 1.05.
5 times 5.
1.05.
10.5.
So it's going to be 525,000, right?
Right.
Okay. All right, so let's put that in as our new payment amount. Now you can actually do that, save yourself a few steps, just put it in down here. 525 as the new payment, and then see what the flow through is on the rate of return.
It's 5% per year.
Oops. Yeah, no, 5% just overall.
Okay.
So one time shot at the beginning.
And what does that represent?
The 5% increase in revenue.
Oh, okay. Generally.
I got 10.5.
Okay, let's see here. You get 10.5%. Okay? So now, this is interesting. And the reason I said it's not what you probably think it is, because your initial thought and gut reaction is, well, if I increase my revenue by 5%, is that not going to increase my overall return by 5% and get us, in essence, 15%? Okay? No, because what you're doing is you're really increasing the basically the overall return by you're adding 5% to the overall return, okay? And so in this case, it's basically 10.5%. Does that make sense? So it's not as much as you think it might be, is I guess what I'm trying to say. That this is only a 5% increase in overall revenue each and every year. So the flow through or the impact it's not going to raise you from a 10% rate of return to a 15% rate of return. It's only going to actually raise you 0.5% to 10.5%. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, just for fun, this won't take really any additional time. Let's say that we take that 500,000 and we were to multiply it by basically a 10% increase, then that would be what? 550,000, yes? Okay, and we were to put that in as the payment.
Brings it up to 11.
I'm sorry?
Brings it up to 11.
Yep, so bring it up to 11, all right? Okay, make sense? Okay, now, what about changing then the resale value? Okay, how much of an impact might that have?
Much bigger.
A lot.
Okay,
Because that's ridiculous.
so let's just say we kind of go back to our original scenario here for a second. We put back in the 500,000 as our payment, and we solve for the interest rate, and then we get back to where it was 10%, okay, just from the calculator's perspective. But now we go in and we say, okay, well, what would be, in this case, a 5% increase in the resale? That's going to be 5,250,000, right? And that's going to be the future value. Okay, see what impact that has. Okay, what do we get?
7.8.
It's 10.81 rounded it. But isn't that interesting? Doesn't raise it, I mean, it raises it a little bit more, but it's not like dramatically more, okay?
We only went up to.
I'm sorry?
We only went up a very small percentage though too.
Right. I mean, so, I mean, we go up 5% in the resale price, and that really only, you know, it takes it from 10 to 10.81, whereas going 5% up in the revenues off of the property, you know, only raises 10.5. So the, you know, the difference between the two is really, you know, it's not that dramatic. Okay? But what I wanted to point out there is that it's not, and that's the reason why I wanted to use a simple problem where you're, obviously it's a 10% rate of return, you can kind of visualize it a little bit in your head as to what's really going on. But, you know, if you were given the choice sort of saying, okay, I can either raise my revenues by 5% or I can raise my resale price by 5%, which would you choose? Okay, the resale price under this scenario. Okay, not that dramatically different, but it's different enough that, you know, it is. Now that brings up another point. So whenever you're thinking about owning a property, what do you really think about? Are you thinking about the operating income that it generates on a year-by-year basis, or are you thinking about trying to score big on the resale?
Income.
Okay, you're saying it depends.
Depends.
On market
Depends on the kind of-
conditions.
It depends on the kind of investor you are.
I like that.
If you're looking at the long.
So let's just ask, okay, if you have to sort of classify yourself, let's put yourself into one of three camps. Either you're going to be, it's all about the operating cash flow, it's all about the resale price, it's sort of, it depends, or it's, you know, somewhere in the middle, whatever. Okay, so how many of you say it's all about operating income? Just, I mean, there's not a right or wrong answer. I'm just curious, how many of you think it's all about operating income? Okay, how many of you think it's all about the resale price?
I think it's both.
Okay, how many of you think it's really both or kind of in the middle?
That's a cop-out.
Well, and obviously, I mean, you know, Cedar is right. I mean, it does depend, but this is the whole thing. Depending on the kind of investor that you are, what is your real objective? You know, because, you know, some folks, you know, like our guest speaker on the very first day of class, Chris Murphy, his strategy is what? No, it's cash flow. It's all about the cash flow. You know, because he sells very little of his portfolio, all right? And so, you know, what can he do to maximize his cash flow? That's his objective,
Well,
okay?
but he's getting property, looking forward as well, like trying to find an area that will forward.
Oh, sure, but at the end of the day, if your objective is not really to sell your portfolio or even develop a portfolio, it's to really, you know, focus on just operating income. That's all you really want to do, and sort of be a property manager and that sort of thing of the property. It's a very different strategy than the strategy of saying, okay, I'm buying a property, I'm going to do a quick fix up and I'm going to flip to get basically the resale value, you know, or, you know, the combo of sort of saying, yeah, I'm going to try to get what I can out of the property, and then if the market gets to a point to where it's just worth so much money that it's obscene that I would not sell it, then, you know, yeah, okay. But, and that's where, you know, it sort of gets into market timing of sort of saying, okay, do I really feel like we were at the peak? Do I really feel like I want to lock in, you know, the value that, you know, I have achieved off this because I really feel like the market's about to turn in a different direction and I want to cash out and move on into other things?
I feel like it also depends too on what you could sell it for and what it's being rented out, because if you can't base the cap off the first year, you know, like if it was 4 years later and you could sell it for like a price where you're, whatever you sell it for, you're really only getting like a 5% cap, it might be better to just sell it and take the money out, put it in something where you're getting a higher cap on that money.
It's kind of like the whole concept of, you know, what are your opportunity costs? You know, in other words, can you find a better investment to place, into? That this one has sort of run its course, or it's maxed out in value. You're not going to be able to squeeze any more value out of it. Because think of it like this. To keep things simple, and I know, several of you have bought and renovated and that sort of thing, especially like multifamily properties and that sort of thing. At some point with that property, you max out the amount of rent you can charge. You minimize the amount of vacancy that you can have in the property. In other words, it's fully occupied. You've got your operating expenses down to absolute efficiency, and so there's really nowhere else to sort of tune it up that much more to really eke out any additional value. So you kind of got to sort of say, all right, this is it. It's running at maximum level of performance, and maybe now's the time to sell before I have to incur maybe significant renovation cost or significant capital expenditures on replacing equipment or whatever else it might be. And so let somebody else kind of deal with that. I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Your return is awful if you don't sell, too. Like Chris Murphy, like obviously what he does is for cash flow, but like if you did a return profile on him, it's probably low because he's not getting any of the reversion, which is the majority of your return.
It can be the majority of your return, but not always.
Most of the time, though, is it not?
He's also building up equity and everything.
Yeah, it totally depends. Like in his case, yeah, he's building up equity. So at some point, once again, the properties, yeah, they're fully paid off, but at the same time, there is that operating cash flow, and that can be significant. More than enough to be content with, live off of. It's all your sort of objective, and not being taxed in the same way that a capital gain would. There's all those kind of, other issues to sort of explore.
Well, like the funds that are raising money and want a return on the assets, they don't hold them. They sell them, majority of them, unless it's like a REIT or something, right? Because that's how they get on the sale. That's how they get the big pop.
Perfect segue. Okay. So you brought up the point. What about a REIT? Okay. So one of the things that obviously we need to talk about are real estate investment trusts. First of all, what are they?
It's tax status.
It's a tax.
It's basically a tax status thing. They were created in the late 1950s, but didn't really rise to any sort of popularity until like the late 80s, early 90s. And the reason they rose to such popularity then, and I can remember this really well because it was about the time that I was getting into all of this, you basically had the massive destruction of property value in the late 80s. And the reason you had that massive destruction of property value in the late 80s was tax law change, believe it or not, okay? It's hard to imagine that tax law change could have such a dramatic impact on something, but it did. In 1986, they changed the tax law, meaning at that particular point in time, they lengthened depreciation terms, which has a negative impact on ownership of real estate value, okay? And they specifically did away with minimized passive losses, okay? Which meant that people were investing in real estate for all the wrong reasons because in essence they were getting basically income tax shelters on other income that they were generating off of other income that they had on non-real estate income. But then we're able to take that income, invest in real estate that wasn't making any money, still gain equity in the real estate and ownership of the real estate, even though the real estate itself was losing money right and left. Well, what it was doing, it was perverting the real estate market to where you were having properties being built strictly to take advantage of tax reasons. And so you had an oversupply of property that was built, okay, a massive oversupply. And so what ended up happening, then we had oil prices that kind of went down a little bit. That kind of triggered basically the whole, it was just like a perfect storm of horribleness, okay? And so what began to happen was, kind of like we were describing earlier with Cole's example, that you would have property owners that maybe had been operating their property and doing so well, but then the property across the street ended up in foreclosure, and then it got sold at a much lower reduced value, enabling it to compete with properties that had a much higher sort of investment in them. And as a result, you had this sort of spiraling down of values to where many of the properties that were being sold, you had almost a cataclysmic sort of event with respect to property values. That you had pretty much office buildings that literally were worth not only just zero, but were worth negative dollars. And in your head, how could that be? Because you think bricks and sticks value. But the problem was you had no tenants because you had such an oversupply of product. And if you have no tenants to occupy the property, what value does an office building or a retail center have? It really doesn't. But yet the problem, beyond all of that, it's not like you get to hold that property on your books without any cost. What do you have to do? You still have to pay insurance, property taxes, a mortgage, security, whatever else, base level of maybe utilities and so forth. And so many of these properties, for all intents and purposes, had really almost a negative value. And you couldn't almost give them away. The banks, were having immense difficulty. Okay, that's setting the stage, and you're sort of saying, well, how does all that relate to real estate investment trust? Well, at this particular point in time, all the banks were completely gun shy of real estate loans. Even if they were good real estate loans, they were totally, completely gun shy in the sense of, real estate loan? No, get away from me. That was just like, not going to do it. So what happened was the market, responded by saying, okay, we've got to figure out some sort of a way to start financing real estate purchases and do so in a way that allows it to maybe, to a certain extent, even bypass the banks. And so it's almost kind of like crowdfunding. Because what you all of a sudden have happening is you create these real estate investment trusts, which were vehicles exclusively for the ownership and operation of real estate assets. And so this empty building that maybe did have some value, that maybe you could get some tenants on, this REIT was able to sort of say, okay, we're now open for operation as a real estate investment trust, and we're going to acquire, that office building over there, but we need all of you as investors to basically throw in some money and buy some shares of stock, in this real estate investment trust. And what we're going to do is nationwide, literally billions and billions and billions of dollars were being raised through these real estate investment trusts to be able to basically reposition the market in a way to where the value was basically being reinstilled within these properties. They were buying the properties, in many cases, the real estate investment trusts were buying the properties for like 10 cents on the dollar, okay, of what they were originally cost to build. And so the value creation was just insane, okay? And so people who invested in real estate investment trust, pretty much in the early 90s, had some pretty massive rates of return, obviously for several years while the market kind of began to sort of reconstitute itself. And then eventually, the real estate investment trust was no longer needed because banks, again, were back in the business of lending. But for a very significant time period, pretty much up into the early 2000s, real estate investment trusts were super popular. And I remember because one of my very first sort of retirement kind of, choice of things to invest in were real estate investment trust. And I hit an absolute home run because, in the early 90s, investing in those real estate investment trusts as a retirement, sort of fund, oh my God. I was getting like 24, 25% annual rates of return off of those, funds invested. But the point is that real estate investment trusts have played this role of being able to provide liquidity into the real estate market. And so the big benefit of them is that if you buy shares of stock in a real estate investment trust, you can buy that share of stock today, hold on to it for any length of time, and then sell it. And it's a really easy transaction. It's no different than selling a share of any other kind of stock. Okay, and that level of liquidity was super attractive to investors because unlike traditional ownership of real estate, where you buy a building, you go through all the brain damage of having to close on that building and operate the building, and then if you were to want to sell it, all the tax implications, all of the other complications of selling that thing, a year, 2 years, 5 years later, and all the transactional costs were enormous, versus doing it as a real estate investment trust, where okay, you get a few 100 or 1,000 people together to be able to buy shares of stock in this thing, hold on to it, and then whenever one of them wants to cash out, they cash out and sell it off to somebody else. Easy peasy, okay? But, there are, and you're saying, well, why isn't all real estate just owned by a real estate investment trust? I would hope that would be one of the questions that would go through your mind. Because there are restrictions on how they can be formed and then how they operate, okay? In terms of the formation, one of the things that's an absolute minimum, even for a privately held real estate investment trust, how many members or how many shareholders do you have to have at a minimum? 100, okay? And then you also have a restriction on what percentage of ownership basically any of those folks can have. So specifically, you can't, basically you can't have 5 owners owning 50% or more. Okay, so if you think about that, all right, so minimum gotta have 100 owners, and then you also can't have a situation of where 5 people that are shareholders own more than 50%. Okay, so those are at least 2 minimum sort of. So well, right there, that creates some issues, because one of the big holders of sort of private real estate are what? Families. Okay, well, chances of you having 100 family members that you want to include in a joint real estate ownership thing is probably it's stretching it a little bit, and then within that keeping the ownership equal, or keeping once again a core group of 5 people from having 50% of the ownership is probably going to kind of preclude that. So you kind of automatically just sort of scratch that off the list. But also you've got some other weird quirky things with real estate investment trust. One is how much of their income do they have to pay out each year?
Minimum 90.
Minimum of 90%. Okay. What happens if they don't?
Tax.
It gets taxed, and taxed, pretty heavily. Like, for example, anybody have any idea what the sort of relatively flat tax rate is for regular C corporations?
Yeah.
About 35%. Okay. So here's the thing. If you're a real estate investment trust, you own all of these assets, and so in essence, you end up paying 0 in taxes. What happens is you pay 90% of your income, taxable income, to your investors.
So they're getting what, dividends or
They
cash?
have-
They're getting dividends and cash flow basically from the real estate investment trust, and so the investors, they pay whatever their tax rate is on that income, okay? Meaning that, once again, the real estate investment trust itself as an entity does not pay, okay? It is what is called a pass-through entity, in the sense that it sort of bypasses having to pay income tax, all right? So that versus a traditional C corporation, all right, where the tax rate is 35%, but you may or may not still pay dividends to your investors, who may or may not be taxed at, let's say this is like 28% is your investor tax rate. So in other words, you have $1 of income in the C Corp, taxable income, 35% of that basically goes bye-bye and then that remaining 65% that you potentially may pay out to your investors then would be taxed at another 28%. So you're left with, a lot less money. So there's a real advantage to obviously having this as the ownership structure of the the real estate because you can avoid that sort of double taxation. Okay?
So who does that benefit the owner of the REIT tremendously?
Yes, tremendously.
And then, but if they're giving out 90% of their income, so then that's.
Well, this is, okay. With every wonderful thing that the government provides, they also provide strings attached. Okay? And so, you know, additional strings that get attached to this are, it is set up to be a ownership and management entity. It is not meant to be a real estate trading entity, meaning that they can't just sort of like constantly buy property, sell property, buy property, sell property, buy property, sell. They can't do that, okay? They have limits on how much of that they can do, okay? They also have limits on, in essence, I mean, even, like one of the examples they even give in the book, which I think, you know, it makes sense. Okay, let's say that there's a portfolio of properties that's up for sale, and you've got 100 properties that are in that portfolio, and but maybe there's only 20 of them that you actually want to buy, okay? But you're forced to buy the entire portfolio. Well, the REIT maybe can't buy them because they might only want 20 of those properties in the portfolio, but they would be forced to buy the whole thing, and if they were wanting to get rid of the other 80, they would basically be precluded from doing so without severe implications of potentially destroying their tax status as a REIT, okay? So the point being is, you've got a lot of quirky restrictions on what you can do. I mean, the ideal thing for a REIT is a buy and hold strategy. That you find properties that fit within your investment horizon of, here is the specialization of the kind of property we want to buy. Here is the geographic, maybe location. Here are maybe the quality characteristics. And so what you see in most instances, for most REITs, there are always exceptions, but most REITs tend to specialize by property type and or geographic region, okay? Because, you know, they sort of have, here's what we invest in, and, you know, this is who we are. And they don't want to go outside of that because it goes maybe beyond their expertise. Okay?
So for a REIT owner, it's essentially, they're able to buy property for virtually nothing. I'm trying to understand how the REIT owners.
Liquidity. They're looking for liquidity because they can reissue out debt. They can tap the capital markets and liquefy their assets.
So is there like a time frame?
20% equity, right? They can pull out that equity through the private market.
So how long do they have to raise the money? Like, do you have to?
Well, they're going to do, basically they're going to go up to the capital markets just like you would do a new issuance of stock.
But do they have to have properties that they already own?
They have to have properties they're acquiring, yes.
Like acquiring, or that they currently own? Or
In other words, in essence, what's going to happen is they're going to identify, let's say, these properties they want to purchase. We've got $100 million worth of properties, and then they're going to go to the capital markets and they're going to say, hey, we want to buy this $100 million worth of properties and raise the funds to do so from selling shares of stock.
And so sellers are willing to say, hey, yeah, come buy my $100 million portfolio, even though I know you have no money, you're going to go try and raise it, and there's an off chance that you're not going to close. Like that's. No,
it's usually most of these REITs are pretty established in terms of being able to make this happen, because they have maybe several other $100 million worth of assets already under their ownership and management. And so for them to go maybe get another $100 million is not as big of a deal as you might think it is.
But there's a genesis to it. So like,
yes.
Does that mean that you have to go private and become a $100 millionaire or a billionaire before you turn yourself into a REIT? Is that like?
No. I mean, you may start as a smaller private REIT, but in some cases, yeah, initially many of these were sort of value funds that, in essence, they were finding below market value properties, simply locking up the rights, the option rights to purchase those properties, and then going out and securing the funding from the stock offerings.
And then so essentially they could just sell the equity or the shares and essentially pocket that, no? Because then like they're buying what they currently have. and they don't necessarily need to.
No, they don't take ownership until they raise the funds.
Well, I mean, like you said, it's a value fund.
Yes.
Someone goes out, they buy $100 million worth of real estate, and then they create a REIT, and then they sell shares.
Yeah, no, you're talking about, okay, yes, if somebody were to do that, take themselves out of the game, yes,
And
that's
then
possible.
they could just collect and then be a 10% ownership.
Right.
And then essentially the money that they collect is their money.
Potentially, yeah.
Really?
I mean, to a certain extent, it's not that dramatically different than crowdfunding. Okay? I mean, it's really, in one sense, it's just that the difference is that, well, crowdfunding just in and of itself to buy an asset may not be bought as a REIT, as an entity. It may simply be a partnership ownership structure as opposed to a real estate investment trust.
Is this a complete institutional play then? Like, we can't, me and John said wanted to.
If you want to start a REIT, yes, you can start a REIT, but you've got to have a minimum of 100 shareholders and 5 people cannot control 50% or more. Simple as that. One of my former students several years ago, probably 20-something years ago, formed his own REIT and did just that.
Right. Do the same rules apply to a private REIT?
Yeah.
And then the book also talked about the 90% where, because of depreciation, is really 60 to 70% payout. How does that play out?
In what way?
Like, how do they get to 60 to 70% payout through depreciation? Because they're sheltering.
Yes, they're sheltering part of that income. In other words,
with the schedule.
yeah, because I mean, think about what is depreciation. Depreciation is a non-cash sort of transaction. Depreciation is nothing more than sort of the IRS is allowing you to write off a certain, 127.5 of value every year for residential property, 139th a year for commercial, and you're able to simply use that to minimize your taxable income.
But what I can't grasp or get through my head is that you have a set schedule with depreciation. If you refinance, you can't restart the schedule. And as a REIT, with the REIT status, you can't buy and trade property. So how do they consistently get 60 to 70%?
No, I think you're misunderstanding what the value is. The point is they're able to not have as much taxable income because they are taking that depreciation. Is all it's really saying. Okay.
It's still an amazing deal.
It is, no, but the point being is you can buy properties, obviously, as a REIT, as a C Corp, as a limited liability partnership, limited liability company, as an S Corp, as a joint venture, and I hope is that in the real estate law course that there's some time spent on that, yes or no? Or you haven't gotten to it yet?
Not yet. So how would you, in a perfect world, leverage a REIT? If you wanted to take advantage of it and be entrepreneur, how do you do that? What is the plan?
Okay, once again, there are different kinds of REITs. There are REITs that are simply equity REITs, 100% equity, so all of the money that's paid in goes 100% to funding the property. So it's literally an all equity REIT, okay? Then on the other end of the extreme, are basically mortgage REITs, okay? Which in essence, you are buying, the REIT itself is buying up mortgages.
Okay, so like a property REIT.
Right.
Well, maybe not necessarily. So are all property REITs 100% equity, or are they
Not necessarily.
No,
Okay,
they're
so they're
hybrids
leveraging.
too.
Yeah, they're all different.
I'm just trying to figure out how you can get to that point. It's just, you can't just go round up 100 people and say, you know what I mean, and say, hey, we have $100 million worth of property.
So one of the things that you ought to take a look at, this is sort of while we're talking about this, if you go to NAREIT website, which is the National Association of Real Estate Investment Trust, okay. On their website, one of the many things that they've got, like REIT data, I think, let's see. It you can go in and get all sorts of data about not only the market as a whole, but you can drill down specifically into regions and identify, number one, who the players are, what properties they have, because here's one of the big advantages we haven't even talked about. So with a real estate investment trust, if they're publicly traded, what do they have to do?
Publicly disclose
All of the information about the operations of the properties. Well, think about
audited as well too.
I'm sorry?
Audited as well too.
Right. So from that standpoint, that also had a huge impact on basically the transparency of operations of commercial real estate that did not exist prior to the early 90s, where to a certain extent you really had no idea, truly, how one property was faring against another property in terms of performance, whereas with that information now being publicly available, you can, drill down at the property level and say, okay, what percentage are these, folks truly occupied? What are their, the big value is on the operating expense side, so that you can kind of see how much are they spending on a per square foot basis or whatever on each item of their operating expenses, and be able to benchmark yourself that much better than you ever were, before. So to me, that's a huge benefit of having that level of transparency of the information, so it's not all just kind of smoke and mirrors. Okay. But to the extent that you want to learn more about, what REITs are available, kind of anything and everything you want to know, this NAREIT website, guarantee will answer every single question you could almost imagine. Okay. Yep.
One of the things that the book mentioned is also about retained earnings.
Yep.
So because of the fact that you have to, disperse those 90%, to dividends. So my question was like, okay, so how do you keep the REIT besides, buying properties and all that without having to invest, future stuff without having that money there? So the only way would be to raise that money through the shares and that's
Yes. Yeah, because you're not able to keep that money. Okay. In a normal corporation, this is once again a disadvantage of the REIT. In a normal corporation, let's say that you've made money off of something, okay, whatever that is, okay, and let's say it's real estate for the sake of whatever. But in a normal corporation, if you've made money off of the development of a piece of real estate, maybe you're able to refinance it or whatever and cash out some of that equity and maybe potentially reinvest in another property, okay, you can do so very easily and not have to issue more stock, okay, as a normal corporation. Because you can just basically self-fund, self-perpetuate in terms of the structure of that entity. But with a REIT, it really gets into what I would sort of tend to call more, it's like project by project financing, okay? To me, it's like going really old school, and kind of the origins of this, if you think about it, like the European discovery ships in the 1500s, how were they financed? It was like a project by project kind of mission. You had a king, queen, whoever saying, okay, we want to send a ship, into, the Caribbeans, and we want them to bring back, whatever, to our home country. Well, what would they do? They would self-fund that particular trip, that particular ship, that particular captain, that particular crew, send them off. They have a singular mission. When they come back, they sell the proceeds from whatever they've got, divvy it up, and then it's time for the next mission, but what began to evolve were, companies that were saying, oh, why don't we just sort of get into this as a self-perpetuating business to where we don't constantly have to get project by project funding from, somebody, that we can basically self-fund ourselves and be more of a perpetual kind of ownership structure. And that's kind of the beginnings of the traditional sort of corporation where they can sort of self-fund. Whereas with the REIT, it's really kind of almost harkening back to a project by project sort of financing structure. And you're saying, well, why do we, because ultimately at the end of the day, what is it all about? Income tax. Okay? And it's like this entity was created for this purpose, this entity was created for this purpose. One has certain tax advantages and certain restrictions. The other has a different set of tax advantages and restrictions. And it's a question of you then trying to say which one best suits whatever it is that you're trying to do. Simple as that. Okay? Don't make it more complicated than that. That's really what it boils down to. All right? All right. Other questions on that before we move on? Okay? Doing okay? Need a break? Yeah, I can tell. You're starting to get a little loopy. Okay. Take a quick 5-minute break.
That's all right here.
Yeah, they do all kinds of weird stuff. So it's a big warehouse. I invested in this one.
I did showing last night on that property, I think I'm gonna get 185 for it.
It's all about the work.
Good, man.
Nothing to say. Oh, that's fine.
Huh?
Fine.
You have a lot in it. Damn. It's nice.
I like the timber one.
Glass.
Going to number 7.
Yeah, but like this is
Number
yeah. But my buyers are literally
Right, and the inventory.
self reached out though, like not, I'm not like scraping stuff. So
They're chopping up trees.
100 shareholders.
So are you,
But the
and then 5
increase is
people
like,
can own
are you like,
like I keep trying, like yesterday,
Not for this one, like I have
They
the couple, I
can't
have like a
own
handful,
more
that's
than
just,
they got a massive project
but,
for houses.
but yeah, I mean, I sent it out to the majority of the wholesalers, and say like, hey, like, you.
So it's linked to the
buyer,
housing market.
pay you a fee for sure.
Yeah, it's like,
But obviously the goal is to like the test so,
yeah, you're a
yo,
conservative.
let's start a REE.
I don't even know that.
one day, man.
I don't, I
One day for sure. That's the goal, bro.
I'm gonna talk about it.
Yeah, you do that.
This is from last week? Oh, okay.
Yeah, they are.
Very interesting.
But I was trying to build just this part, and I even did an if analysis, and it still didn't.
Okay, well, let's take a look at it maybe after class.
Cool. Point of that one, whatever it is.
This 360 right here, is this okay? I'm out of it that we
No, I'm sorry.
That little 360, is this normal?
Oh, I think that's for the,
I mean, honestly, it's all around our logistics as well.
I don't think so. This is, it's really for the,
Data warehouses. It's only analysis assignment models.
I don't remember if there's a warehouse or whatever that gets paid to do. I think it's like.
no, it's for like the math function on this that's like in blue. I'm trying to minus for any reason.
It was from the state.
But in order to be in packs, I gotta have at least, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's not gonna step.
Are we to resend it completely? Oh, sorry. No problem. I don't think it's affecting any numbers actually, but just wanted to make sure. One more thing. I think I lost you when you were explaining this number to that. Like I followed you to the end, but this has to do with the NR, with the value.
Yeah,
Right, so how did you get this 260?
That number
Yeah?
divided by that number.
So the distribution per year.
Like, it doesn't seem like it's
And it's just that payout. That's where.
I tried that one, but I didn't get it.
If you put it together, So if I want 10,
So I don't know
if
what
I want,
yeah,
say,
yeah.
I need
Well, no,
10
because
grand.
it doesn't really have mathematics.
Yeah, but what about?
That's,
It'll depend on how much, this is gonna depend on the price of the stock.
Like value.
so I wasn't doing perch, right?
Yeah.
Four. Is that how you do it?
It's gonna be right now. Obviously, but it's gonna be changing year by year.
They cover the REE. So you got 30 dollars. That's a dollar right there. I would have to add that.
Quick question, you said that five people can't have 50%, they can't have more than 50%.
They can have, basically, 5 people can't hold more than 50%.
Well, you're not getting
Either way, well, I know what you're saying, but 50% is the demarcation.
Yeah.
What's the minimum capital that you need to
There really isn't. There is a minimum in the sense of, if you're going to do a publicly traded REIT, it's got to be a sufficient size to be able to justify the initial public offering cost. But outside of that, you don't
sell
know.
when
it's private, you don't have
Yeah.
that restriction.
You just have the number of shares.
not taking the hit on
I
capital.
literally didn't know like 10.
Yeah, eventually.
How was that? It is. It's so like, it's like a hidden gem.
You went to his office? I took the test there last night.
Right, it's like a income. You have to declare as income.
Because I wasn't there Saturday.
I like having games, but it's,
Chris Murphy's? Oh, no, I'm sorry, I thought you were talking about white.
Okay, let's get started.
Bracket is not gonna change because of 10 grand.
yeah,
So,
absolutely not.
well, close, close.
Once you hover, once you hover
You're really
like
gonna pay, yeah.
once you're gonna want to reach 480 grand to like really everybody
I thought that's why you were over there. You just.
Yeah, that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, he's so stuck in his ways. People in single family houses, like vacation rentals, way, way. There was this like little 2-1 or 2-2 or something in Hall Hill. Now they had, if you rented it out, you make like 12.
you have to pay $500
like 60.
for the property.
Like right by the water.
It's,
I mean, there's management companies that literally will just take care of it. He manages his own property. I don't pay for it.
It's kind of like, you know, the person who does that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not opposed to it. I just, it's a lot. I don't know.
Yeah.
So if you're willing to dive in it, then it's.
So what that'd be my first.
Well, I have to redo.
So the first thing is how to hire.
The only way that I would build a single family is vacation rentals, sub to owner financing. No, exactly. I mean, he looks for, and what about, I think, $75,000 to $100,000 for every down, $500 a month.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like $500. We have a lot of
Yeah. You're trying to get up.
I mean, the only thing of this is like the acquisition of the property, so like you find a really shit person, like
No, exactly.
We have a crystal ball.
It's just like not necessarily.
What is the market shift in your area because of how they subsidize that? And you're all on the same
I'm like, I wonder who was that.
that's all it's.
Probably a decent amount, like, yeah.
He said this was.
Okay, so to kind of continue on with the discussion we were having a little bit ago that I want to make sure I kind of get back to. All right, so So assuming you've got two different properties that, or in this case, two different portfolios of properties that you're looking at, both of them have the same acquisition price of $100 million, and the annual sort of income from this property is going to be $10 million a year, and then ultimately you're going to be able to sell it for $100 million, but then you've got the $10 million worth of operating income embedded within that 5th year cash flow, okay? Over here, $12 million a year, and then embedded within this, you've got, I think, like 80-something million worth of reversion with then the $12 million sort of cash flow. Now, if you do both of these, put both of these into your calculator, trust me on this, both of them end up giving you a 10% rate of return, okay? Now, my question, assuming that both of them are giving you a 10% rate of return, which one would you prefer, and why?
The one with the bigger cash flows.
Right. Yeah, I would prefer B. Because I don't have a crystal ball.
Okay, and I think it's a pretty good answer. Because think about it.
Slumlord over here, right?
Both of them are giving you 10% rate of returns. So from that standpoint, you're indifferent, okay? But would you prefer to have income now than income later?
Yes.
Most people, yes, okay? There are always weird, strange people that maybe want to defer income into the future for some other reason, usually tax reasons. But barring that, you're probably going to say this one is going to be the preferable deal because you're getting an extra $2 million a year of operating income, even if the resale value is sort of suffering. This also is kind of an illustration of what we were talking about earlier, that this property, you know, with the operating expenses that we've got and everything, that our income, you know, is not as high as it is over here, but in essence, we're maintaining the value of the property. We're not increasing the value of the property, but we're maintaining it. Over here, we're yanking out an extra $2 million a year, basically because we're not doing repairs and maintenance or other things that maybe we might need to be doing. And that's actually having a detrimental effect to the overall value, because you're basically, what we're saying is that we've got an asset that has gone down in value from $100 million to about 80-something million dollars after you subtract out the $12 million of operating cash flow. And so you've lost a significant portion of the value simply because maybe you haven't been maintaining it. So in one sense, most all of us are basically saying the same thing. We pretty much want to be a slumlord.
You want to be a
You want to be a slumlord.
slumlord?
You want to yank every dollar you possibly can out of the property while you own it, put as little into it as you possibly can, and then ultimately at the end of your holding period, you know, don't really worry so much about the resale value, worry about, you know, obviously how much you're able to pull out of it. So having just said that, does that then change your perspective at all?
Just the slumlord aspect.
You don't like the label.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Capital management manager.
Okay. but I mean, there is some truth to that. And I know it's sort of funny to talk about, but there is a legitimacy to what we're sort of saying, that, you know, as an owner, as an investor, you have to develop a strategy for, you know, how you're going to operate, you know, and how you're going to maintain the properties, you know, what sort of reputation that you want to have, you know, all those, you know, sorts of things. But at the end of the day, you know, I would argue that many more owners probably migrate over into this sort of category because they're saying, what can I do at an absolute minimum to keep the property maintained and to keep it occupied, and don't necessarily go the extra mile, although there are those that do, you know, and they probably don't get as high of a rate of return simply because they are maintaining that property to such a high level. Judson?
I think there's a lot less work you have to do for the same return too. You just kind of like say screw it, you know. As far as if you have to do the maintaining, every you know 6 months you're putting in money and you're worrying about getting something fixed, and on B, you just sit back, you know.
Crisis management, basically.
Yeah.
But it's
Okay.
like, it's not like that, like the doors, the windows are broken, the doors are falling off.
Right.
It's just not as pretty.
Right, well, I mean, simple things, I mean, you know, once again, we tend to take it down to the micro level, but I mean, it'd be things like, okay, instead of replacing the carpet every 3 years, maybe you replace it every 7 years. You know,
Just
instead
get rid
of
of it.
repainting it every, you know, 5 years, you replace, you know, you repaint every 10 years. You know, instead of doing, you know, it's a lot of those kinds of decisions, but yet, you know, does that have enough of an impact to, you know, drive your rental rate and your occupancy rate up and down?
Well, I mean, there's just things that you can do, like you can pressure wash your building, and then now it looks new, instead of painting it.
Okay, fair enough, all right.
But you also take the risk of losing your tenant and then have vacancy. So I kind of like keeping it up. That's more my philosophy, the A side.
Right.
Yeah. For that reason.
Or you can just break it down. I mean, you have 2 extra million, take 1 million and just put it into the property.
Yeah, I know what you're
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, no, but that's what I'm saying, it's always a trade-off.
It's a trade, yeah.
But you know, in neither of these scenarios, really, it really take it to the extreme example. Because you have other property owners that maybe would be even further over here on this side, so maybe you get $8 million a year, you know, off of the operating income instead of 10 million, but yet maybe your residual value is substantially higher simply because you've over-maintained it, you know, to the point of where it's in an immaculate, you know, shape, so whenever it does go for resale, then it's viewed as being more risky, or I'm sorry, less risky, and ultimately
A better opportunity.
a better opportunity for someone to come in and purchase, you know, just turnkey. So, you know, all I'm really trying to illustrate with this is just, once again, a mindset of an investor of sort of saying, okay, are we really, you know, what kind of investor really are we, and what are we really trying to achieve? And, you know, at the end of the day, if the returns are in essence the same, but it's just a question of whether we take the money now or we take it later, behavior tends to, you know, yeah. But here's the thing, okay, it's just very easy to sort of say this in an academic kind of way, because the practicality, you know, as Cole was saying, you know, yes, you're going to be constantly making choices about those renovation decisions or maintenance decisions and things like that. And, you know, it may not be just kind of like a simple, oh yeah, we're going to do this, this, and this. It really does become kind of a strategic mindset of sort of saying, as a policy, here are the things that we are going to do on a regular basis or that we're not going to do on a regular basis, all with the end game of achieving one or the other, or somewhere in between. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Thoughts, comments, observations, John?
No.
Okay. All right, moving forward. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to talk about real quick.
Was that the property risk?
An opportunity, right?
I think it's number 5.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the other things that we want to talk about as it relates, I kind of skipped over with because of Cole's wonderful segue into real estate investment trust. We didn't talk about the value of the management fee. So one of the things that can take place with a real estate investment trust or the ownership of a, you know, just a large portfolio, let's say that maybe you were a family owner of a massive real estate, you know, I won't say empire, but let's just say that you've got several $1 million portfolio of family-owned, you know, real estate, and you decide that for whatever reasons you want to sell off that portfolio. Primarily, maybe the reason you want to sell it off, there's a massive capital gain associated with it, okay, that you can take advantage of. But you, for whatever reasons, want to maintain the management rights to the property, okay, or property management sort of contract on the property, maybe for, you know, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it might be. Why might you want to do that? Because there's money to be made in property management, okay, simple as that. And the nice thing about property management money is it's predictable, okay, because it's usually just a nice fixed fee, you know, off of maybe the value of the portfolio, or off of the incomes that it generates, or whatever it might be. And you know, if you've got sort of an already pre-established kind of property management, you know, sort of firm or, you know, office that you've already been managing the property, so it's no really skin off your back to continue managing it, but yet you've cashed out to a certain extent on the capital gain side, and you're just sort of saying, okay, I can continue to collect rents and make payments and do all that for sort of a fee. It may not be a bad thing, but there's also a simple way to kind of value that. All right, so that's where we're sort of going with this basically question number 6. All right, so assume that you've got a revenue stream off of this portfolio of how many dollars per year? The revenue stream off of the portfolio. Give me a dollar amount, obviously in the millions. Not more ambitious than 7? Okay. Let's go a little higher than that. Let's just say that we've got a revenue stream of 20 million. Okay, this is off the portfolio as a whole. This is not your management fee revenue. This is the portfolio. Okay, and you charge a management fee. All right, how much of a management fee?
10%?
No.
5%? 5.
Probably 4 or 5. So let's go with 4. What the heck? 4% management fee. Okay, so starting with that, how much would we get on an annual basis? Okay, so our actual management fee percent and management fee dollar amount would be $800,000 a year. Okay, everybody cool with that? Okay, now that's how much we're getting each and every year. Now think of this. This is an operating business. Excuse me, an operating business. All right, and we've got to come up with some way, maybe of valuing this business, that if we wanted to maybe sell the management rights to someone else, how much could we value that business for? Okay, and the book used a multiple, I think of around, what was it, 7?
7 years.
Let me see, double check. It's an income multiple. So I think that they used 7 just to, yeah, 7 was what they used, so let's use 7. Okay, so 7 times basically earnings, so this is the multiple, or once again, to use their exact vernacular, the valuation multiple. All right, so you simply would multiply the 800,000 times that, times 7, okay, it's just simply saying that the value of that income
Is that capitalization?
in essence. I mean, it's just, it's sort of turning it around a different way. You know, it's sort of saying that the valuation of the business is 7 times earnings. Okay?
And how would you determine that? Based on market?
Yep. So in this case, that would be the value of, or the management fee value. Okay? So in one sense, what they're saying, here's another way of looking at it. If this is your annual management fee, and they're saying the way to sort of value that is to say it's that the value of that is 7 times this, they're really saying the payback period is what?
7 years.
7 years. Okay? All right? So, what this also means is that if you retain to these management rights, chances are then you have the right to do what? Sell them. Okay? And so all this is doing is just sort of saying, okay, here's how much those management rights maybe value extra value to you to sell off to somebody else. So the point being is this. You have a two-factor play here. You made the real estate play of where you sold the property and got a nice big capital gain off the property. And then you retained the management rights indefinitely, contractually, maybe forever in perpetuity. And by virtue of doing so, now you've got your second play, which is potentially to sell off the management rights to a third party and get another nice little cash flow stream hit that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise had you not retained those. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Do you know if management fees are that low with hotel management companies?
Not with a hotel, no. Hotel is a totally different thing because it's much more intensive than the management. Yeah, with this would be much more, you know, in line with residential office and normal commercial properties. Yeah, hotels are a whole different animal because it's much, much more intensive.
Yeah.
Okay.
And as it goes up, the lower the value of the property.
I'm sorry, what?
It goes up, the lower the value of the property.
The size.
Or the size.
Well, the larger the property, the overall, you know, value of your management fee.
Now the management fee percentage.
I'm sorry, it's going to go.
It's going to go up the less valuable the property is. Or
To a certain extent, yeah. But you're probably going to pay a higher percent if it's a low value property. But the bigger the property is, the lower probably the management fee itself. But 4 or 5% is probably norm. Okay. Okay. Other questions? Now, one thing that's sort of, it's kind of interesting, you know, is we obviously at the undergraduate level here, we have the property management minor, and now starting this fall, we actually have an undergraduate major in property management and real estate. Totally different curriculum than obviously what the master's program, because it's all about basically the management side of the business. So we have like a course in facilities management, residential property management, commercial property management, management of casinos and cruise ships and resorts, and asset and property management, or asset and portfolio management. And so all of those courses, you know, are focused on how do you go about maximizing the value for the owner or investor in a property. It gets back to what we were talking about earlier of, you know, really the big function of a manager or the investor is what do you want to do? You want to maximize the revenue, minimize your expenses, but overall maximize the value of the underlying property. And to a certain extent, that's what the management fee is really meant to try to accomplish. Okay, make sense?
So if you go to buy a property, let's say the price is 20 million. Where do you see this?
Well, no. The value, this is not the value of the property.
Sorry. Okay,
This is only the revenue
Yeah,
stream.
I know. Okay, but let's say you're going to buy property, the price is 20 million. Then that price includes always the management.
Well, the management fee is just an operating expense. But all
It's
you're doing
not
is you're just
revenue.
retaining the right to be that property manager for that property. Because you have unique knowledge, understanding, whatever about the property, you know where all the bodies are buried, you know, it's like it's
included in there.
It's just included. But my point with this is that it's a way to extract additional, in other words, instead of just selling the property with all the management rights included, you know, and, you know, it's fine, you could do that, but then you're potentially foregoing an extra $5.6 million that you could put in your back pocket because you could sell off those separately.
I see.
Here's even another sort of similar sort of example with just fundamental real estate. What can you carve out of that real estate and sell separately? Mineral rights. You know, you can sell basically the surface rights. You can sell, you know, just the, you know, in essence, you know, a ground lease. But you can also, you know, sell the mineral rights or retain the mineral rights. And what you're going to find, especially in states where, you know, like in Texas specifically, that almost all the properties that sell do not sell with the mineral rights. Those have already been carved out by a prior owner. And so most owners of real estate in Texas don't actually own their mineral rights. In other words, so if there's gas or oil underneath their property, They don't have any right to access it.
And then they can sell it separately.
They can sell it
I
separately.
mean, whoever has them.
Correct. Right. And they do. Okay. Any questions on that? All right.
So, like say I'm buying a property and they have the management fee as a line item. And they also say, because this usually happens, you have the option, management fee, blah, 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 X percentage. I'm not buying that particular management company and I have the option to use them or not.
Depending on, okay, maybe I didn't make myself clear. So, all right, let's say that I own this portfolio of properties. My family has owned it for many years. I, in addition to owning it, have been managing it, okay? I go to sell it to somebody else, all right? I engage in a contract to sell them the property, but I am retaining the management of that property as part of the contractual agreement in the sale of the property.
So it's explicitly in the contract.
It's explicitly in the contract that I am retaining the management rights. Okay? Does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay? All right. Got that. Okay. So one of the things that your text wanted to sort of make a distinction of is the difference between return of capital and return on capital. So let's talk about that for a couple of seconds. Okay, what is the difference? All right, let's say that I have invested in a property $100,000. Okay, and I generate operating income of, $10,000 a year. Is that return of capital or return on capital? That's return on capital. That's like an operating income that I am receiving, and so that's a return on my investment, a return on the capital that I've invested. Okay, but let's say that I go to sell the property, several years later, what is that going to be classified as? Return of capital, getting back my investment. Now here's the part where it gets a little bit tricky. So I'm an owner of real estate, and some people tend to sort of look at it as, if I own real estate and I'm operating that real estate and so forth, that I am going to, first of all, try to pay myself back, then generate a return. Okay, kind of like, in other words, sort of like, it's almost like a payback period kind of thing. Of saying, okay, I just spent $100,000 on buying this property, and it's generating $10,000 a year, but instead of looking at that $10,000 a year as return on capital, I'm looking at it, I'm taking that $10,000 a year, I'm sort of stuffing it in the mattress, so to speak, to pay myself back each and every year, so that I can basically get all of my capital back, and then at some point, it's just going to be sort of free and clear money, return on capital, after I've paid myself back. Does that make sense? Okay, it's just a different way of looking at it, a different way of spending it. And the reason why your book makes this distinction is that the normal sort of operator of real estate and owner of real estate that is sort of buying, trading, sort of developing, that sort of thing, sort of looks at everything kind of what I, first described, which is, you receive, the operating income, and we review that as a return on capital, and the return of capital comes whenever we sell the property. But what if it's a real estate investment trust? How do we sort of view that? And not so much as the investors in shares of that real estate investment trust, but kind of the investment trust kind of as an entity unto itself. It, for the most part, is generating just a consistent return on capital, because maybe the thought is that the real estate investment trust as an entity really never returns, it's not really a return of capital as much as it is sort of a perpetual kind of return on capital. Does that make sense? Okay. And so they sort of make that distinction just simply from an investor's perspective of what is your objective as an investor. Are you really seeking one or the other? Are you seeking both? Are you seeking some combination? And because you'll hear a lot of people sort of talk about this whenever, the way in which maybe they approach investing as to whether they're really looking for return on their capital or return of their capital or some combo. And so, but most people, as I said, I would argue they're looking at operating income as the return on capital, and then the return of capital would be simply the resale value. Okay? Make sense? Okay. Well, last question. So, one of the things, and actually, Lily brought this up during the break, but what happens if you want to sell your real estate investment trust in the sense of, well, you want to have an initial public offering, an IPO. And so one of the things that you've got to sort of take into consideration is your real estate investment trust, number one, big enough to justify doing an IPO? Because the cost, and all of you understand what an IPO is, an initial public offering, which is basically saying, all right, yeah, we're going to issue stock, but we don't issue it, as in the sense of we're not going out and directly selling these shares to the public. We're usually having to hire some sort of investment banking firm, the kind of the Goldman Sachs of the world, to, they'll come in, they'll sort of say, okay, your properties, as a portfolio are worth so many millions of dollars, and then they will say, okay, in order to raise the capital for your real estate investment trust, we're going to charge you all of these fees and so forth for doing so. And your text basically says it's not uncommon to expect that IPO is going to cost you 10%, of the property's, all the collective value of your property. So if you're selling a portfolio of $100 million, what are they really saying? That cost of that issuance could easily be $10 million. Okay, well, that's a pretty sizable hit, because think about it in one sense. Let's say in terms of leverage on that. Let's say you're 50% levered, okay, in the sense 50% debt, 50% equity, okay, kind of going into that transaction. So in other words, $50 million of equity, $50 million worth of debt, okay? Well, what would that mean in terms of the loss, if you will, on your equity?
20%.
Yeah, it's going to be a pretty significant, it's going to, in essence, have like a 20% impact on your equity because of, you're going to lose that. Okay, does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yep.
In the traditional equity markets, there's been a number of companies in the last few years that have self-issued their shares. Is that not true for a real estate trust? You're not allowed to do that?
No, there are certain restrictions, and it gets into this whole thing of qualified investors and then the size of the issuance, and that is a part I'm going to be the first to admit I am not an expert on. So that
REIT is basically a tax status, so it has to be approved through the IRS.
Yeah.
And the IRS has to be compliant with the SEC and all that jazz.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is one area is not my thing. So that one I can't answer. Okay. Anything else? Other questions? You ready for the quizy?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, repeat it.
Okay, so once again, if you have $100 million of a portfolio that you are going to take public, and you're saying that 10% of that potentially is going to be eaten up with basically the initial public offering fees to Goldman Sachs and the like, and it's levered 50% equity, 50% debt, then you're not going to be able to waive the debt. So that means that full 10% is really coming out of your equity. So what that means is that's basically eroding, $10 million of your equity, which represents 20% of your equity. Right.
So
Okay.
what you're saying, the question might be,
It might just be what percentage of your equity is eroded.
okay,
Okay?
got it.
Okay.
20% because we have
It might just be, or it will.
Yep. Okay. All right. Let's see here. So this quiz should be a little bit quicker than last week's. Should be a little bit easier than last week's. There's no guarantees.